About a week after the George Floyd incident, I was invited to participate in a group dialogue that consisted of Black men from like their early 20s to their mid to late 30s. And of course, because of everything going on, we met via Zoom. The overall discussion was very intense as the majority of participants shared their own thoughts and feelings about George Floyd, what occurred, and the protests that followed soon after. Um, there was one particular individual, I'll never forget, a younger guy who was very quiet. I mean, he did not say much of anything early on. But when he decided to contribute to the conversation, he described feeling paranoid. Those were his words, since the incident, and that he didn't know who to trust and or share his feelings with. And I just remember his perspective was so deep that it resonated with all of us, and the entire dialogue shifted from George Floyd and the incident that took place to Black men and mental health. Um, and what I also remember from this experience is that it really challenged us to address a particular topic that is rarely addressed. But at the same time, it also provided us with an opportunity to share our feelings and put them into perspective, all while giving us a safe space to do so. Um, as I remember sitting there and listening to all this being said, it helped me, in a sense, understand some of the frustration that I was personally experiencing since this happened. Due to the nature of my profession, it's basically my job to put others first. And I've encountered people who have been impacted by this incident. But I'm in a position, of course, where I'm supposed to be the fixer. And so it felt like I wasn't able to openly share how I was feeling with anyone. So after a while, it began to really take a toll on me. And I didn't really understand that, or at least put it into perspective, until I participated in this dialogue. So it was very refreshing to again be in a space where I could freely articulate my feelings and address my own mental state. And we haven't had a discussion like this since the summer. And while this doesn't mean that everything was good to go, it was definitely needed. Um, and since it happened remotely, we weren't there to really comfort each other physically, um, but we were still able to create uh, a much needed safe space for ourselves. And I feel as men of color, our mental well-being is something that stems from a deep place, and it can be very delicate. And it is very important, especially as men, that we continue to provide each other with emotional support. So, I mean, this year in particular has been crazy, but with everything going on, I hope we can continue to make an effort to discuss this on a regular basis.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second Men of Color Dialogue, Men on the Mic. Today we have a special edition due to the month we're in. So for those that don't know, this month is actually Movember. Movember is an international men's health awareness month. During November, traditionally concentrating on fundraising events, bringing awareness to prostate and testicular cancer and suicide prevention. This year for the Men and Masculinities program, we've chosen the theme of Black men's health, bringing the intentional focus through our events to the health and well-being of those who identify and experience with and are in community with Black manhood or masculinities, past, present, and future, or fluid. Today we have the honor to have Shawn Johnson here to us today. So Shawn, would you like to introduce yourself, our special guest?
Yes, thank you, Christian, for having me. So my name is Shawn Johnson. I am currently an academic advisor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Prior to being at Santa Cruz, though, I had the honor to work um, at Cal Poly in a variety of different positions as a graduate intern. This is, of course, where I met Christian. And so I'm just really happy to be here and address a very, very important topic.
Yeah. So going into that topic so today's topic that we're be talking about is having a little discussion together, Shawn and I, is Black men's health. So the things that we want to kind of focus on and kind of segue into is why is it important for us to understand and kind of know about experiences of Black men's health in a community, which, in general, going through my kind of initial research and stuff, I actually went through and read some articles from Ronald J. Thorpe, which is PhD, which is a co-director of the Concentration in Health Equity and Social Justice professor at Johns Hopkins. So he actually wrote that Black men are one of the poorest health profiles in the United States. And sometimes this can be like very hidden, but very in plain sight, because we know that Black men do experience a lot of adversities throughout the country in itself, since the beginning. So we want to bring this into vision, and see why we need to pay attention to this. And overall, men in general with their health and all, it's really hard for some men to experience and talk about what they gone through, or even share their experiences, or go get help they need that they need, because a lot of men do believe more in health repair instead of health maintenance. And that's very important that we want to bring into this light and kind of show how these patterns and these things affect us as men of color, especially because we do face more adversities and kind of discriminations and things throughout our country. So we just want to check up on that and kind of have a discussion on how this plays out in our country, around the world. But yeah, so first off, what we kind of want to say, get into, is why do we need to raise awareness for Black men's health? And this is kind of a question I want to ask you, Shawn. What are these things that we should be aware of, or what should we be talking about?
I mean, I feel like you pretty much covered it in that opening statement, but I think by understanding somebody's mental well being, you have a better understanding of who they are just as an individual. Um, because of the detours or because of the adversity that we have to face day in and day out, Black men's health is very, the topic itself is something that's rarely discussed even amongst Black men. Because then you also have that factor of men disclosing their feelings and being vulnerable, and just, the quote unquote stigmas that come with that. Um, and I also think too, it's a catch-22 situation, right? We know, okay, we're going through something, we're experiencing something, but it's like, if we hold it in, then of course that can take a toll on us in a multiple, or excuse me, a variety of ways. But then if we go out there and we express how we feel, if we're not perceived as somebody who needs help, more often than not, we're perceived as a threat. And so then we kind of lose out on the opportunity of being able to seek help. And so I think to really just understand, because unless if you're Black, to be honest, you're not going to know what it's like to be a Black man. But
Mhm.
to really just understand what we have to face, and the stress that we oftentimes have to endure just to make it through another 24, I think could bring or shed light on just who we are as a people, in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally what I understand. We were talking about, one of the kind of things that kind of shocked me, but I kind of, through my research and stuff like that, that I can understood, is there was a quote from Dortberg, where he said, with the average lifespan expectancy of a Black man is actually 72 years of age, and that's the shortest lifespan of all age groups. I mean, all groups by race and gender, except Native American men. But that was kind of put in perspective. Like I said earlier, Black men have one of the poorest health profiles in the United States, and that is kind of a generational thing, that's taking a toll. And I kind of, from my experience as a Latinx man, coming from that background, that's shocking because my grandfather, he died at a young age, and that's for the causes of that. It was from health related issues that he didn't pay attention to or he didn't express throughout his early stages of life, which unfortunately he passed away at an early age. So that, going back into this kind of conversation of like men's health, we had to like kind of put in perspective, because it is kind of it is this like kind of destructive health patterns that we have to go through, and kind of acknowledge and kind of talk through with other men, other people, and make sure that we have these conversations around here. But around that kind of that topic, like socially, like social conditions that happen around like racism, segregation, discrimination. How do you think this affects Black men's health specifically in your experience?
I mean, it drastically affects Black men's health. Um, I've been, just taken into this year, right, and everything that's kind of been happening, or you've been seeing on the news involving Black men, and whether it's George Floyd, or the young man who was jogging, who was shot and killed for simply jogging. Um, it's kind of like we live. We've always kind of been or followed through with the mentality of being like a survivor, right? But now it's just like we're paranoid. And to kind of go back to your grandfather, and even my grandfather lived to be 78, but prior to, he suffered from heart related issues, which I think was triggered by a lot of stress that he endured at a much younger age. He grew up in poverty. He grew up in a segregated community. Um, and so he didn't have access to receive certain care, and so he kind of held it in. um, and I remember, I think when I was in third grade, he had to have heart related surgery. um, but I do think just what's going on around us, and not really being able to, again, articulate how we feel, because when we do, it always is our fault, or we can always do something better. you know um, I mean, hell, we can't even kneel to protest what's going on without people possibly losing their careers over it, or having to deal with other stressful factors that may not just impact them, but their family and anybody else close to them. And so it affects our mental well-being, because we're being told constantly that we can't necessarily respond, knowing that we can, and knowing that we should have the opportunity to do so. It's just, even in responding, we have to deal with another hurdle, right? Um, it is extremely exhausting, right? And people cope with it in different ways. Some people are extremely vocal about how they feel. Some people hold it in. Some people resort to some rather questionable behavior to kind of cope with everything going on. But this all stems from, you know, what our family members, or elders, should I say, had to go through. Kind of stems on, or how I can best say it. It's like how they were raised. They kind of raised us the same way, not really understanding or grasping the fact that this is a completely different era. My grandmother, who's still with us, she was always a firm believer that boys don't cry, and was very uh, vocal about, if a boy was crying about something, especially if it was just like how he was feeling or whatever the case may be. And so it's kind of like a tape that plays in your head, right? You hear that from your elders, you hear that from your peers, um, you know, uh, and there's, from my experience, there's always kind of been a balance of masculinity. Sometimes there's like this hyper sense of masculinity where it's like we don't cry, we do whatever we need to do. And then it was just like, you know, the opposite end of the spectrum, where you can sit down and you can talk about your feelings and you can cry it out, or respond however you can. But for the most part, it was never really consistent. It wasn't like we can sit there and talk about our feelings consistently. But what was consistent was, kind of getting on somebody or making somebody feel a certain way for expressing certain emotions, and so you just didn't do it. Um, and so I think a lot of that trauma stems from, you know, what our elders had to go through. I think there's something about, trauma related to slavery and how that's like genetic, right? And so there's that whole bit right there, which we can really go down the rabbit hole about. But the best way to really sum it up is that it's really hard out here because it just feels like no matter where we go, we run into a wall and we run into it hard, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and like how you were talking about, like earlier, like how the structural forces, how the key determinants such as like religion, like spirit, like stress in general, incarceration, racism, all these things like have a high proportion effect on Black men, and we've seen that in our country, we've seen that across time, and it is a big kind of determinant of like the health and well-being of Black men, and we need to be talking about these things and how to try to break these barriers down so we can acknowledge as men that it is not something that we should hold inside of us, and we need to talk about it. We need to express it, how we feel and how we are, because it is a huge determinant um, of how we trust the system, even in that sense too, because there is a lot of people, men of color and like people of color in general that don't have trust in the healthcare system because of like these segregated kind of like laws and like things that we have, but it does exist, like it does happen because um there has been research like from being in the segregated areas, you do tend to have more than not poor health if you live in those areas, and then like particularly among like Black men, like what they were saying, it's like they've if they kind of live in these areas, they have like more high crime rates, something essential poverty, standardized housing, but it's not because of like us as men of color that um, we've lived through this. It's because of the whole thing and policy of itself and how we are as a nation and stuff like that. But it goes back, we have the power and we need to talk about these things. But kind of going from like my experience, right now, um, I kind of went back to like the health wise in general, creating like safe spaces to talk about these issues and being able to express myself like through words can be like powerful in this sense. So going to like the next like topic, like around worldwide right now, like protests have been happening, and what do you like? There's been like worldwide protests against police like killing Black men. Is it possible that that this movement might lead to greater recognition of Black men's health concerns, in your eyes?
I don't know. I think, I think it can shed light on it, but in terms of progress, I'm just not sure because you have footage of all this going on, right? And there are people who are still out there justifying what we're all seeing. Um, I don't know how you can justify placing your knee on somebody's neck for almost 9 minutes when they're cuffed. Uh, and so again, it goes back to even when we speak out, we're still shut down. Even if we have the evidence there, we're still shut down. When I was 5, I'm kind of aging myself right now, but when I was 5, Rodney King uh, was assaulted by the police. Um, and it kind of comes at me in waves because, again, I was 5, but I just remember kind of seeing clips of the video around that age or as I got a little bit older when they would talk about it. And I'm thinking, nothing happened to these police officers and it was on video. Um, And what's going on is that I think people are uncomfortable. And so the best way to maybe avoid whatever discomfort they're feeling, they just justify it, or they try to, you know, they come out of the woodworks and bring up somebody's criminal history, and say, well, and essentially it was like they had it coming. They may not say that outright, but that's kind of the message that they're sending us, is that, about 3 years ago, this guy had an incident and he was arrested, and now look at him. Is he really an angel? Is he really a good person? And it's like, I don't really care for the most part what he did 3 years ago. This man complied and still lost his life over it. Um, so I think the media uh, definitely paints a different picture, um, at least from my perspective. To everyone else, it's probably like, oh yeah, this is great. We're 2020, we're actually acknowledging these things. But then, you start hearing about shortly after, the cases of COVID that are rising. What I was hearing is, since you have all these black people out here in the street and all these other people protesting, the cases of COVID are rising. So it's like it's really how you perceive the narrative. And just from a historical perspective, and then just again from our lives and what we probably faced, even if we're watching the news, when we're looking at the same story, there's a 99.9% chance that we're going to perceive that story differently than somebody else in the room who doesn't really know what we're going through, or, to be honest with you, doesn't even look like us. Um, I think the more they cover it, or the way they cover it, I think it causes more of a divide, because it's the same formula. Incident happens, look at all these people acting crazy. Uh, then let's go back there and let's find like some random Twitter post. It's just they get really petty with it instead of acknowledging what actually happened at that given time. So I really think the poor journalism, I don't see it getting better. What's going to happen, unfortunately, is that it's going to happen to someone who's not a person of color, for people to be like, oh my gosh, because then when they see it as a problem, then now it's everybody's problem.
Yeah.
But if they don't see it as a problem or an issue per se, then it's just their problem. It's in their backyard. We're good to go. Our neighborhood's safe, right? And so, I mean, you can look back at like drugs and crack in the 80s. When all that stuff was in the quote unquote hood and the projects, no one was really saying anything. But then when that stuff started to make its way into, the suburbs, all of a sudden we're having DARE and all these programs are coming out of the woodwork, and it's just like, say no to drugs. And, so I think the same thing is going to have to occur when it comes to police brutality. But I wouldn't want anyone, regardless of who they are and what they look like, to experience that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like funny, but like to think about it that way, like that has to happen to someone else other than people of color,
Mhm.
because we've been going through this since like the beginning of this nation. So it's difficult. And the thing I was like thinking about it, like with all these protests and all these things happening, to people of color, but especially like black men, like what is like the psychological impact it's having on individuals, and especially on youth, because like that's what was something like we were talking about earlier, when we first started talking about this, because it's difficult, because we are like racially profiled, and that stems from all of this, from the media and everything, that we're, we're portrayed in a different light, and
Yeah.
that just adds different, like a layer of stress in our lives, a different like perspective how we go about like our own health or our own lives. But we do need like spaces to talk about it with people who are willing to listen and not blow it off, because that's what we need. But I like feel like right now, we are kind of on this movement to making us change, but it's always going to be pushing. We always have to do extra work. As people of color, we've done this. We keep doing it. And that's what think like, that's what we have to do. so they can't make it seem like, oh, it's nothing, because
Yeah.
it's something. It's affecting all of us, and it affects us, our health, our well-being, and overall, so with that being said, like, how can we as individuals or as a community, like, raise awareness or improve spaces for Black men to feel comfortable and taking care of their health, as a number one priority?
Well, I think we need to really get out of our own way um, when it comes to expressing our emotions and just kill that I guess way of thinking that being vulnerable is a form of weakness. Um, I feel like we're harder on each other than people are in some cases, um, and we need to get out of that. We need to really be proactive and create these spaces, and you were talking about the youth. The youth are exposed to more things than I was ever exposed to through, having access to social media and all that, and just the news at their fingertips with their phones, right?
Mhm.
But we need to acknowledge, when it comes to the youth, especially Black and brown youth, there's always a seed that's planted in their head at a very young age. Some children know it, some children don't, but as they get older, you know they're triggered by certain things and they don't know why, right? But what they probably aren't considering or thinking about is something that happened to them when they were like 9, 10 years old. I remember my first run in with law enforcement. I was 10 and they asked me about a fight at a high school. I was 10. How would I know about a fight at a high school? I was on my bike and the lady pulled me over and was like interrogating me about a fight. Um, and I remember when it happened, it was scary, but then, like, as I was getting older, and it was just something I didn't like to talk about for years, that was 23 years ago. And so I think about that and I think about where we're at now, and we need to reach out to those kids. We need to identify those kids who are going through that, and create these spaces and have these dialogues, um, and let the world know and let each other know that we are capable of more than just how we're perceived. Um, and so it's definitely going to take a lot of work, but I really do feel like it's going to have to start with us, because we can't reach out to them, obviously, because we know how that movie ends, right? So we really just have to hold each other accountable, um, just as decent men, right, who happen to be Black, um, and create something. Because I think, too, you kind of have there's division within our community as Black men, and just how we're supposed to act. And I mean, it's just, and a lot of that again stems from way back when, but it's just so toxic that I feel like we can't really put the full blame on somebody else you know so accountability is definitely, I think, the way we need to what we need to adopt first in order to move forward.
Yeah. And like talking about that, what you were saying a little bit, and like adding upon it, um, just like going in the beginning, just finding about research or seeing about like Black men's health, there wasn't that much info. So
Mhm.
I feel like as as individuals and like kind of scholars, we should kind of, or like politics and stuff like that, like we should gather more intel on like communities of people of color and see what's affecting them, because like I said earlier, like it's it's like us as a community, what affects us is our community, or like health programs, laws, and stuff like that, which we need to change for people of color to improve that and like raise awareness, like we were saying, and improve spaces better, and improve these spaces. So like to enact this change that we want to see, we need to be able to inform our people, of what is happening, or like what is going on as like as a whole to prevent these things. So just like you said, like raising awareness and being able to hold ourselves accountable, but also those in power, to help us as like as a whole community, as a whole nation. uh, but other than that, like how do you feel that black men can take the first step in themselves in creating this kind of healthier um healthier like sense of themselves?
I think the first step is going to have to be literally with them, right? I think in order to help others, you have to get help yourself. Um, because again, triggers are very real. And sometimes we don't really know what our triggers are until we're in a situation and we're triggered and we respond and things could possibly get out of hand. And so I think for us to address the traumas within our community or within, let's just say, younger people, we have to address the trauma within ourselves if we're experiencing such trauma. Um, if we're not, which is very rare, but if we're not, educating ourselves on the trauma that people experience being who they are. Um, and I think that's where it needs to go. But again, it goes back to that vulnerability piece. In order to really hold yourself accountable, you have to make yourself vulnerable, and you have to come to terms with the fact that maybe you weren't going about this the right way. And for many people, that can be a bitter pill to swallow. But if you're able to go through it to get to it, then I suggest you do it, right? And that's kind of for me being in the profession that I am as an advisor. I don't just like help students with their courses. Like I really talk to them about certain things that they're going through, and I on occasion I've been able to talk to younger black men um, about things, and I feel like now at my age 33 I'm able to have these conversations because in order for me to really be successful in this program I had to come to terms with certain issues in my life. um, had I not done that and then I was placed in this job, I think I probably, being in the position I'm in, would cause more damage, not just for them, but for me. Um, so definitely looking at yourself in the mirror, I think is like the first step for sure.
Yeah.
Because kids are watching you, they see you, like you're more than just like somebody out and about. You know, you're definitely, whether you know it or not, or it's said to you, there are people who look up to you for whatever reason. And that's something that's a responsibility that you need to nurture, and you need to protect at all times. Because the last thing you want to be is that person who led someone the wrong way because you weren't doing right. um, so again, I think just getting help for yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Um, Thank you again, Shawn, for taking this time to speak about your experiences and just having discussion with us. Because this topic is very prevalent, especially in the times that we are today. It's a great kind of conversation to have and just kind of express how we're feeling and express and acknowledge, that this is like things that are or that we're living through that we let that are that our people are living through, but yeah, like we need to continue having these conversations with other men of color, especially just to bring it to light and make them understand that this is something that we can change individually, like you're saying, may be the change that you want to see around. So again, thank you again for coming out and speaking to us. But that is it for our show.
Well, thank you again, Christian, for having me. This was definitely a good experience, and so I appreciate it.
Okay. Men on the mic out.